Fantastic. Thank you very much, Richard. I suppose there you have it. We can actually bring things back from low population numbers if we just put our minds to it, and this is clearly something that we do need to celebrate and really make a point of. We can have conservation successes. As part of the report, however, and because we always have to see these changes in context, we also looked at the context of population increases and also at the implications that this might actually have for us Europeans, which I suppose is kind of something that we're talking about in this session. And many of these points have already been done by the other speakers in this session, and they're probably also more eloquently said than I will be able to, but I will try my very best. So, we have seen these amazing recoveries in populations across Europe, but we do have to see this in context. Quite often you get asked by journalists, so we've seen increases, so that's great, we're doing all the right things. We have to see this in context. In many cases, our populations have not yet reached viable status in any shape or form. If you look at some of the examples, the roseate tern here, for example, after a massive crash in the past, it's now kind of recovered to about 2,500 breeding pairs. The Spanish imperial eagle, yes, has shown a massive increase, but this is from a very low population size in the first place. So yes, we are doing the right things, but we need to keep pushing. Similar, there's examples from mammals as well. The bison clearly has been highlighted as one of the success stories. This is a species we brought back from being extinct in the wild. So yes, we have seen increases, but it's still very small and localized populations. And I suppose the Iberian lynx, where you've seen that from the data up to 2005, we didn't really see a population increase. We have seen recovery since 2005, but again, this is like a very rare cat, about 300 individuals in the wild in 2010. And I suppose what this does tell us, though, is that, as Richard said, the Birds and Habitats Directive, our species legislation, really did have a massive impact for these species. Now, these are species that in the past have been quite often overhunted. Quite a lot of the species in our data set are tasty species we like to eat, or they're species that like to eat the tasty things that we want to eat, and hence we persecuted them in the past. So with this kind of threat, where legislation and enforcement of this legislation really can bring a turnaround and changing of attitudes of people, we've done pretty well. So that's a great success. What we also have to consider, though, is that there are lots of other species that aren't doing too well, and these are quite often species that are affected by very wide-scale habitat loss type threats, anything to do, for example, with agriculture. These are the kind of things that we're not doing very well. Invasive alien species have been mentioned earlier on. Lots of our freshwater systems are not doing very well, and so on and so forth. I suppose importance of legislation. Richard already mentioned the Birds and Habitats Directive. We already heard an excellent talk about what Natura 2000 has done, and hopefully we can use these measures to really push forward also the recovery of the species that are currently still lagging behind, or in fact that are still in decline. What we do quite often here, though, is, and I suppose particularly in the current climate, is that quite often nature might be seen as an obstacle to growth. I'm sure none of the people in this room necessarily think so, but quite often if you get to the higher echelons of politicians and so on, you might do hear that. And this is really something that we need to change. I would argue, and as part of the report we argue, that this is not necessarily the case. There are opportunities in wildlife comeback and in wildlife in our natural world. And this is kind of the type of stuff that, as a conservation organization, we go and teach or tell people about in other parts of the world. So why can we not do this in Europe as well? We all like to see big things. We go to Africa, we see the big five, we go to Borneo to see the orangutan and so on. So clearly at the moment, Europe isn't quite thought of as the nature wildlife watching hotspot in the world, but maybe this could be at some point in certain areas, like we've already heard about some of these wilderness areas that are coming back. The associated infrastructure with this can bring jobs, particularly in areas where there really isn't much else in terms of industry. Recreational activities bring in money. People are willing to spend money on this. Obviously, it's got to be sustainable in terms of fishing and hunting. And also things like local produce, local culture, local food. This is kind of the stuff that we like to do elsewhere in the world. Why not in Europe? But I suppose there are also ecological benefits. Being a kind of conservation scientist, we kind of keep going on about the ecological benefits pardon me, of wildlife. And I suppose the species that we looked at in the study are generally the large species that very much shape our kind of trophic system, so our kind of food webs and so on. This is my very basic representation of what we generally want to see. We want to see the plants, we want to see the wild herbivores feeding on the plants, and we want to see the predators ideally controlling the wild herbivores. Now, in many places in Europe, we do not have this natural system, and this can actually also prove relatively costly at times. Just a few examples here. If we do have predators, but we don't have wild herbivores, what quite often happens is that the predator will switch to livestock instead, and we're generally not that fine with that, particularly if it's our livestock that they're eating. This is an example from some data from an EU report on grey wolf, showing the annual number of livestock taken by wolves in the two largest wolf populations in Europe. And overall, generally, the numbers are relatively low. The highest one here and the largest one is about 1,200 animals. If you kind of transfer this into the wolf population, it's not that bad. If you look at a country like, wrong button, if you look at a country like Greece, where there is no wild prey base, as opposed to up here, where there is a wild prey base, suddenly these numbers go up. And that's because in Greece, wolves feed on livestock. There is nothing else there for them to eat. And then it comes with a large price tag. Other examples, I suppose, we know about as well. We have a lot of the management to do ourselves, because where we don't have wild herbivores, but habitats rely on grazing, for example, we have to bring in our livestock to do this, or we have to bring in people to manage this. Where we don't have predators, we actually have to go in and manage the herbivores if the herbivores get too numerous. So we do actually do a lot of these things ourselves, which is costly, I suppose, in certain ways. I suppose a way in which this is illustrated in our report is when you look at vultures as well. That's at the scavenging level. And quite a lot of the vultures that we looked at, our comeback species, what we had to do is to actually put in what's called vulture restaurants. I heard it referred to as this, which I quite like. Essentially providing the carcasses for them, because with EU law on sanitary law on how to dispose of carcasses of your livestock, and also with there not being a wild carcass base, this is literally what we had to do. So our systems really aren't terribly natural, and yes, we want wilderness and all of these things, but these are things that we need to address as well. And I suppose lastly, before I run over time, I think the wonderful thing about this story, though, and about the wildlife comeback, is that we can essentially, as Europeans, start reconnecting with our nature. I think we've already heard beforehand that most of the population in Europe is urban population, just like in many other places in the world. It's this trend towards urbanization, which, unless you count the urban jungle as wilderness, really does remove us from nature. At the same time, though, we have seen some of these species coming back. So from my perspective, for example, say if you were born in the mid-1970s, not that I was, clearly lying here, then literally what I see now, as opposed to what I might have seen when I was a kid, is completely different. Doubling of populations in some cases, like here for the peregrine falcon and the stork. In fact, the stork I can now see regularly when I go back home to see my parents. When I was a kid, there weren't any. Now, I think this is great. In some other cases, this might cause some issues, because to many of us, these levels of wildlife that we see now may seem unprecedented. We have not experienced them in the past, and this is again relating to shifting baselines. And with this quite often comes the notion that, oh, there's too much wildlife because we're not used to that much wildlife. And this is essentially where conflict with wildlife and with kind of conservation goals and so on can come from. And I think it is vital that we do remember certain things that we do in other countries and in other places in the world to really combat these kind of things that might change attitude of the general public or landowners and so on and so forth. And this is stuff that we do as a conservation organization or worldwide, really. Environmental education is absolute key. Generally, it is the more people know, the more positive the attitudes of them are. Communication is key, and whether this is via photographic exhibitions or whether this is, for example, via our comeback report, this is stories that we have to tell, and we have to kind of keep pushing these stories. And also, I suppose, in the past there was more wildlife, and we managed to deal with it. So maybe we can learn from traditional knowledge as well, and see if there are any measures that we could take. But first and foremost, species legislation is great, and enforcement from the top is great. But I think, and this is something that we do worldwide in conservation, involving communities is absolutely vital, because we all need to benefit from this wildlife. So these are just a few kind of thoughts that I want to leave you with, and the kind of things that we need to tackle if we want this wildlife comeback to continue. And I'll just finish on thanking various people involved in this report, namely Rewilding Europe, who commissioned this report and who received funding from these organizations, the Swedish Postcode Lottery, Liberty Wildlife, Arc Nature, to fund this report. A few other people who were crucial in discussions and stuff about wildlife comeback. Christian Jung, who made it look absolutely stunning, the report, so big thanks to him. And I was told that I think this report might be on the memory sticks that you received. In case this information is wrong, you can also download this report from the BirdLife website, from the ZSL website, from the Rewilding Europe website. And I believe there's also hard copies available if you want to have a hard copy from the Rewilding Europe stall in the exhibition space. Now, before I hand back, though, to the chair, Richard and I would really like to take the opportunity to invite two people to receive a copy of this report. And these are two people that we've already heard about, have been absolutely crucial in bringing about these changes to European wildlife. So I would like to ask Angelo Salsi from Head of Life, and also Eladio Galliana from the Council of Europe, to come and receive these copies of the report. Thank you very much.